that I also need to drink.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. So, today we are going to talk about The Trouble with Peace, which is the second book in the Age of Madness trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, which is the final trilogy in the First Law universe. So, if you haven't read this one yet, please look away. This is going to be a full spoiler filled discussion. And I'm quite excited to talk about this one. So, of course, I am joined by Raf today. I have linked his channel in the description box down below. Jose, I think that he's still at school. His kid had a play that he needed to perform, and it's taking a little bit longer. So it's just going to be the two of us, but I am quite excited to hear your thoughts, Raf. Did you like the book or?
I did certainly like the book. I think I'm I'm in general. I think I do like this second trilogy much more than the first trilogy. I'm not sure if I like it more than the standalones yet. That kind of depends on the end of the whole thing.
Okay.
But
So
yeah,
did you
cheers.
enjoy the standalones more? Do you think that they are stronger than the trilogies so far?
I would say that the heroes in particular, and possibly Red Country, except for one or two things that I really don't like about it, and Best Served Cold are much stronger than the first trilogy. The first trilogy has a lot of pacing issues for me.
Hmm, okay, that's interesting. Because the original trilogy was actually my favorite one so far, and then Red
Okay.
Country.
I do like Red Country a lot. My only like really big issue is with the I keep forgetting what the name is of what basically stands in for like native tribes, or you know what I mean.
Yes.
That's sort of where I'm not sure if you could actually make that work within the first law universe in a better way, but it just kind of rubbed me the wrong way he was describing that, and I was like, I don't know, man.
Hmm. Yeah, I think maybe upon a reread that I would be a little bit more critical about that. I just really like the father-daughter relationship, which you have more in the first half of the book. But
Yeah, I did like that, and there's a lot of fan service, of course, going on with that whole scene where you're basically waiting, spending the entire book waiting for Lamb to actually do the Bloody Nine thing.
yes, exactly.
And yeah, it was handled really well. So I do like that. I think the Heroes is probably his strongest book, from my memory. But it's been over a decade since I read the Heroes. I read it when it
So
came
it's up
out.
for a
That's what I'm
reread.
saying. I read it on a
Okay.
release, and that's the last time I read it. I reread the first trilogy last year, so that one is firmer in my memory. But the Heroes, like structurally, is just done really well, I think. And the new
Hmm,
book takes a lot of the stuff that he learned or did practice in these standalones, and he just brings all of that to the table in the new trilogy, I think.
okay. And Jose has decided to join us. Hi, Jose. Glad
Hey.
that you
Sorry,
have time.
sorry, sorry. I was removing makeup from a 4-year-old. So
Life getting in the way.
exactly, exactly. How's it going?
So I'm
Going
doing
good so
fine. It's
far.
the weekend, so perfect. So we were just mentioning how we enjoyed this book. What are your general thoughts?
I I really enjoyed it. I really one of the best books I've read this year. The thing is that because I liked it so much, I dived straight into the third book, which I'm about to finish now. So all the action is now kind of a bit fuzzy, a bit sort of mixed in
Mhm.
my head. But when I finished the second book, I do remember feeling like, wow, yeah, that was a really good ride. I really enjoyed um, the action and all the stuff that happened in the book.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I'm really looking forward to reading the third book very soon. But yeah, um, I think like what I enjoyed about this one felt, and in a lot of ways, I think this one is really well done structurally. Where Abercrombie is using the structure of the novel to do things, and he did some of that in the previous one. I mean, he started out with that in the first trilogy already. When you always in every book you have one chapter called questions, right?
Hmm.
And the way he uses chapter titles to do things in the narrative, I think, is really interesting. We had this part with the battle where we have good ground, bad ground, high ground, and common ground. And you can just see how he uses that to build some structure in the narrative over, like on a level that is, like a meta level, so to speak, over the actual narrative. And I liked that. And you had like the two chapters back to back, growing older or something like that. Growing up, I think, is the name of the chapters. And he did some of that in the previous book in A Little Hatred, and does some of this here. And I think that's what made these books stand out. It's like Abercrombie might be one of the few authors in fantasy that does these very deliberate structuring of a novel where you can see him constructing the whole thing and using all these elements that go into a book, like chapter headings and chapter sizes and stuff like that, deliberately to do something beyond just, having random headings between chapters in a way. And I did really appreciate it this time around, especially, that whole ground series of 4 chapters just made me chuckle when I looked at like the table of contents. I'm like, I see what you're doing there, Joe.
Yeah, I agree. I really like that. It's something normally I don't really pay attention to the titles because they're just there because they needed to be there. You need to
Mm-hmm.
have something to start, and a lot of authors even just do 1, 2, 3, which is fine, but it doesn't really bring anything extra to the table. While here, I do appreciate that he puts that little big extra effort.
Yeah. I mean that's the point for me. Is like these elements are there, and the question is always like, why are they there? Do we need them? There's historical reasons why people had chapter headings in books and so forth. But if you're using them nowadays, why not using them? Actually make use of them instead of just like following conventions. And I think that's something that Abercrombie does a lot in how he structures books and how he structures narratives, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, I think if you are a big fan of that, and I must say, I'm enjoying the first law as a whole, but I don't think that I'm one of the mega fans that you have who think that Joe Abercrombie is the best modern day author out there. So if you like what he does, he brings more of the same to the table, but a little
Mm-hmm.
bit better. But if it's just okay, and I must say that I like it more than just okay, but you start seeing the same formula that's being used. And I think that maybe that's why I'm a little bit more critical for this book than for the original
Mm-hmm.
trilogy, for example, where you have Broad here as a character, and I compare him a little bit to Logan Ninefingers because in the first trilogy we meet Logan and it seems like he's a good guy, but then towards the end you see more of him and you see more of his past, and you realize that he's actually a horrible person, that he has that split personality, and once the Bloody Nine comes forward, things are going to end badly for everybody around him. And I could already see that Broad was going to be the same character, but just less extreme. So even though I can appreciate that, and that's just something that I
Mm-hmm.
like in general, it's it's almost a little bit something that you can expect.
Yeah, I mean that's part of what Abercrombie does for me, at least, is exactly that. I mean, I've said that before. Like Abercrombie is very clearly influenced by his work in television, and he does tend towards certain, predictable characters in that way, that they're closer to archetypes in a way. The person that is sort of like very violent and trying to not be violent. The question, like, can you overcome your nature or not, and how much of that is, well, intrinsic, and how much of that is external, so to speak. That's a question that is interesting for fantasy because so much of fantasy is about violence. So having a character trying to not be violent while also clearly loving violence in a certain way on an emotional level, I think is an interesting idea looking at how that works. And I can see Broad being interesting in that regard because while he's similar to Logan, he's civilized. You know what I mean? Like Logan is clearly that Norse, that Nordic berserker kind of guy going into that berserker fury and being like this different person, which was a really clever thing when he did it with Logan in the first trilogy. But
Mhm.
Gunnar Broad is not that. Gunnar Broad is a civilized person from the Union and so forth, and it's more about like these repressed tendencies of violence in a way, and knowing that it's bad, but also knowing that it's kind of difficult to get beyond that in a way. And I think that's what makes Broad work for me. It's not my favorite character, but I think he's trying to do something different there in a way.
I I would agree with your take there. I
Mm-hmm.
just find that maybe a bit like Steve was talking about when he didn't finish the series, is that some of these characters get a bit repetitive. You could draw the parallels between Logan, Cole Shivers, and Broad, and
Hmm.
they all sort of represent the same struggle of the inner self against the nature, or sorry, they desire to be better against the
Hmm.
nature that pulls them in a negative direction, and then it's sort of it's the same character sort of undergoing the same personal journey, and more often than not being beaten down by his
Yeah.
environment. And I think in that regard, I can see now more Steve's criticism after having almost finished the third book
Hmm.
as well, that it gets a bit repetitive. I'm not entirely sure if this trilogy is adding something new to the world.
Yeah, I can agree with that. And I think that I also need to make clear that I'm still really enjoying it. I can just
Mm.
understand why some people say, well, it's a little bit the same thing. And if you look at the original trilogy and if you then read this one, you might see just a repetition. But I like those types of characters, so I don't
Mm.
mind.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting thing, especially with Broad, because a lot of what goes on in this new trilogy is very much about like systematic, like systems, exploiting people and so forth. And Broad wants to change, but like the economic pressures around that and the way he ends up in these like systematic struggles, these system struggles, force him to go back to that. Like, right, he doesn't want to fight, but if he stops being a violent person, he won't get paid, and he has to, do these things for his family. And I think that's what's new with Broad compared to both Shivers and Logan, who don't have that, right? I mean, Logan, especially in like the first trilogy, like later on, maybe in you can talk about that in Red Country, but like those two are sort of loners. Broad is not. Broad does these things for systematic reasons, and I think that's a difference that is important for like that second trilogy that does, I feel, address these structural issues in a way that the first trilogy did not do, I think.
Hmm. That is an important point, I think, because I wasn't really thinking about it that deeply. I thought that the first book, A Little Hatred, you see more that the world has evolved because you have that industrial revolution that is happening. We are in that city and we
Hmm.
see close by what the effects are. And I was thinking that in the second book, you don't really see it that much. But when you then look at the character of Broad, it is there in the background because that's why he behaves the way that he does.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's still about the structural thing, and we see him being exploited for that, and I think that's a general thing. Is like what these systems or these structures of like capitalism and so forth do, and there is that criticism of capitalism going on in these books. I feel it's hard to not read them at least slightly politically, right? Is that we are reduced in a way, like dehumanized by that system. Broad is dehumanized by Savine in that regard because she doesn't care for Broad the person. She just needs someone who is very, very violent or can be very violent to do those specific things. And that's something that like economic pressure does to all of us. It kind of reduces us to certain abilities or skills or whatever you want to call them, but it doesn't care for like the person behind that. And using those skills comes at a mental or moral cost in a way. And the structure doesn't care for that, and people exemplifying the structure like Savine also don't care for that. And I think that's sort of the point there with Broad this time round.
Yeah, I think that I also, with Savine, I liked her in the first book. Well, liked. I thought that she was an interesting character. I still think so, but she has become more ruthless almost. Because in the first one, you could say that she didn't really know what was going on. In Valbec, she was playing this game with other nobles, but now she is really employing somebody, and she does know that violence is being used. After in Valbec, she swore that she would never do it again.
I think I'm not quite sure where I'm at with Savine. I felt like the whole like her descent into certainly a drug abuse in a way. I mean, it's very important. I feel like her descent in this book is very much about, like, her trying to come to terms with the fact that she is, well, in fact, not, Glocta's daughter, but actually daughter of the king, and her relationship, or whatever you want to call it, with the king was actually incestuous and so forth. She does all of that, and it leads to her using drugs to avoid facing those kind of truths in a way. And I'm not sure how much I like the way this is handled. But you can see her, it was kind of started in the first in Little Hatred, but it kind of goes on in the new one. And the amount of drugs she takes in this book is just almost cyberpunk levels of drug abuse in in her regard there, which is impressive.
Yeah, to say the least.
Yeah.
I think that Jose is talking, but I can't really hear what he's saying.
No, I can't hear him either.
And now I think it's bad connection. But hopefully that gets figured out. But now that we do touch upon Savine,
Mhm.
what do we think that's going to happen with Glocta?
In the third book, with
Yeah,
Sand
because
and Glocta, I don't know. I mean, there's two options. One of them is he just, he'll just like sit on his country estate and write his book on fencing, which would be cool. But with the ending and the betrayal, so to speak, of Pike and all of that stuff, maybe he'll get reinstated. Who knows? I don't know.
yeah, I was actually wondering if he was going to come and help Savine, because that would be something that you don't expect. He always tells his daughter to be ruthless, to only think about oneself, but he does love her. So I was thinking that maybe in the end he was going to come and help, and then that didn't happen. And I could appreciate that that was something that was unexpected for me.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of setup still going on. I think that's sort of where I'm still, while I'm still, holding back judgment on this trilogy, is that he's still setting up so many things, and it could go into like a very good direction. It could go very, very wrong as well. And it kind of depends on how, say, the banks and the wizards will react at the end. That's sort of where I'm, I don't know where things will go.
Mhm.
But yeah, I did really. I mean, old Glocta is someone that I can be much less, angry at than young Glocta. And by which I mean,
Yeah.
like, the way he's written. I appreciate old Glocta much more than I appreciated the way Abercrombie wrote young Glocta, because, well, that's a very personal thing. Like, the way he portrays Glocta's disabilities and Glocta dealing with those disabilities just did rub me the wrong way in a lot of ways.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that especially in the beginning, we don't really have bias yet. So
Yeah.
everything that Glocta does is on his own accord. While now
Mhm.
you can see that bias is holding the strings. And everybody sees Glocta as this horrible human being, and also his daughter, the younger generation, they don't really
Yeah.
understand why he does things the way that he does. But
Yeah.
it's not really his own fault. He's
Yeah.
almost like he can't really make his own decisions.
Yeah.
By the way, Jose is having a lot of connection issues, I think, so we lost him. So it's now it's just the two of us.
All right. I hope he'll come back. um, yeah, I don't know. What do you think of Leo?
I, I s- I severely disliked him. I think that he is an extremely annoying character. I can understand why he is written the way that he is. I think that Joe Abercrombie wants to show that he he wants to do the right thing, but he isn't really used to politics. He isn't used to the way things are done. And you see a clear difference between Leo there and Orso, who does know how to play the game. But even with that, I think that Leo is just making a lot of mistakes that even without that background, he shouldn't have made.
I do appreciate how Leo is really the dumb fascist manipulated by the people that use dumb fascists to do things, because Leo's a bigot and a homophobe and a racist and a lot of things, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And yeah, the sad part is he believes in these kind of things for all kinds of, lack of self-reflection and all kinds of things. But people that manipulate him and use him, like the lords in Adua, that's a connection that you have in contemporary politics, where you have people manipulating those sort of like less educated or less self-reflecting kind of people to their own more cynical political means, and to see that exposed this clearly in a fantasy book was something that I did appreciate, especially because Leo didn't get away with it, and no, I did appreciate that, and I still think that the way that homosexual or homoerotic tension between Leo and his friend, whose name I keep forgetting, Durand, I think, right? That guy.
I think that's the name.
First, looking at how crude Abercrombie was with these kind of things in the first trilogy, I just appreciate how almost tender he managed to make these scenes where that tension is there. And I just like, that was just like really well done. That scene when they're, standing on the balcony in Westport. No, not Westport.
It's yeah, I'm terrible with names, but I know what you mean.
Yeah, when they're like on that balcony and they're having that tension, and it's like, and then someone else barging in, and
yeah, and it's gone.
all that denial of Leo's, and I just felt that was just done really well, especially for a dude growing up in a slightly with that casual homophobia and toxic masculinity that is still, for people of my generation, was just part of growing up, right? It's like the whole no homo thing is still a thing for people of at least my generation. I don't know, like the next generation is hopefully already better at this, but like, yeah, I can totally see that from the outside, from the inside. I can empathize with that up to a point. I felt that was just done really, respectfully. I feel.
I do agree with that, and I think that that's something that we haven't really seen in the previous books, and I think that that's something that he included in Age of Madness in a good way. But why I don't really give Leo a lot of... He has Ardy as a mother, and I think that it's if he grew up in the North and he didn't really have that education, and you can see that people who do understand politics better, like the Open Council, they use him. But he chooses to not really trust Ardy, or to
not Ardy. It's Lady Finry. It's different. Ardy is Savine's mother.
Oh yes, of course I mean Finry. Yes, I mean his mother, and he chooses to believe people who are full of hatred, while he has a pretty smart mother, and he knows that she has helped him in the past. So I don't really want to give him a pass for a lot of the things that he does.
Oh no, don't get me wrong. It's not about like having sympathy for the character. I just feel he's written fairly well as a character in that regard. I mean, the other thing is, right, he grew up with his mother because his father is already dead at that point, right? He grows up with a single mother, and there's a lot of, these ideas that, boys with single mothers are overcompensating, and a lot of that stuff is sort of implied. Abercrombie doesn't actually go out and actually explore these elements, but I feel that's part of the point, is that Lady Finry, his mother, is alone, and he's always seeing her more like shrewdness or more careful planning and so forth as, female weakness and so forth. He's very much falling into that difficulty that can happen with that element of, like, say, toxic masculinity, in a way that comes from being, brought up without any like direct male role models, in a way.
Yeah, and you can also see that, well, you of course have the balcony scene, and then the scene afterwards where he, catches his friend, and that is of course an entire thing that has also repercussions later on, because he's so angry that he doesn't really take his best friend with him when he is going to war, and that's one of the only smart people that he has around him, that he still trusted.
Yeah.
But you have almost that denial and that resentment,
Hmm.
maybe internal hatred even. You also see that with um, the Snake of Talents, her son.
Yeah.
And you can see that Orso handles that so much better. And I do really like how that was shown. But at the same time, I think that Leo was the most annoying character there.
Oh yeah, definitely. One thing that I did really appreciate, when we're still talking about like the larger topic of homosexuality, is that almost closure that Queen Therese gets.
Mhm.
And I think that was very much deliberate because back in the day, Abercrombie got a lot of criticism for how he handled Queen Therese's lesbian relationship and how she's treated in the original trilogy. He got like a lot of criticism for that and how she was portrayed back in that trilogy, and he actually acknowledged that criticisms. Like, yeah, but I could have done that better. And her children making it, work out that she actually meets her lover back in, basically away from from Adjoa and so forth, and actually them getting together to, actually reconnect, so to speak. That felt very yeah, heartfelt, to kind of make up for
Mhm.
that stuff that happened before. And I just appreciate, authors acknowledging issues and trying to do better, and it felt very much like that in a way.
Yeah, I also think that that was a heartwarming moment,
Hmm.
and especially that her children were supportive of that.
Hmm.
Because when I read the original trilogy, I didn't really know what it was, but I didn't like that well, basically, she's raped. She
Yeah.
Glosta threatens her lover, so but it's said in a way that poor, well, what's her husband's name again?
Giselle.
Yes, of course. Poor Giselle, because
Hmm.
he has a wife who is a lesbian and he doesn't know. While in it's much worse for her. And then
Yeah.
afterwards, she's also depicted as a horrible woman. She doesn't laugh. She's very strict, very severe. But in this book, you saw a little bit more of her through
Hmm.
the eyes of her son, who says like, "My mother always says you cannot show fear," and that makes her a more human character. She is in this strange country. People don't like her
Yeah.
because of her lineage, and to see her being also vulnerable when
Hmm.
she sees her lover again, I do appreciate that.
Yeah. I think that's like the one thing that I really like, the major thing that I appreciate about this new trilogy, or this second trilogy. You can see how Abercrombie is taking a lot of things from the first trilogy and the standalones, taking all these elements, tying them back together. There's certainly an element of, like, say, fan service there.
Mhm.
Definitely when it comes to like which characters get, like, their chance to just show up and stuff like that. But you can see how he's trying, or at least for me, it read like he's trying to actually, also, yeah, to make things that can be seen as flaws of the first trilogy, how to actually do better in a way. And I
Mhm.
and I do appreciate that level of just, trying to do better in a lot of ways. I
Yeah.
did appreciate that.
And I think if you look at it like that, it is
Hmm.
important that we have this second trilogy. Because you
Hmm.
could say if you just have the original one, you have the standalones, that's fine. Why do we need this? But if you then see that there is closure for some
Yeah.
characters, and you see that next generation who, well, we will see how they do in the final book, but it
Yeah.
is important that we have this one.
I think that the important part is that they're trying to do better.
Mhm.
Their ideas of doing better are definitely not always very good, but at least they're trying.
Yeah. And I think in that sense, also Orso is a character that I've come to like a lot more. In A Little Hatred, he's, well, he doesn't really know what the duties of a king are. He doesn't really know how difficult
Mhm.
his father has it. But now he knows, and he's really stepped up. I thought, well, with that rebellion, it can go either way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the thing that I'm looking forward to find out in the third book, because see, Giselle does go through a similar arc in the first trilogy, right? He goes like
Mhm.
he's an absolute wastrel in book one, and in book two he begins to become like a more responsible person, and then it ends up in book 3 that he really wants to do better, and then Bias shows up. It's like, yeah, fuck it. And the question is how this will end this time round, because there's still the potential that the same thing will happen again.
Mhm.
That's why I'm like holding back judgment on the series, because it could go either way.
Yeah. And I think that this is, especially because we know how the original trilogy was built up, the
Yeah.
second book feels more like glue between the first and the third one. And
Yeah.
I felt that way less for the original trilogy, because the second
Mhm.
one, it has that traveling quest. While this
I
one,
found it
it really
super
depends on how
boring.
the third one. That was my favorite part. But it will depend, because I think in the original trilogy and in this one you also have that a little bit of that vicious cycle of people
Hmm?
try to be better, but at the end they are at the same place or even worse than how they started. So if it's the same thing, then King
Hmm?
Orso will have the same arc, and then in the end it will be a very bleak ending. But in the second book already, at the end, they want him to kill Leo, and he
Yeah.
grants him a pardon.
Yeah.
And you have Yuri, who is the right hand of Bias.
Oh, Yori Sulfur.
Yeah, and you have him telling Orso like, "Are you sure that you want to do this?"
Yeah.
So it could go either way.
We will see. That's sort of the questions, like, do they still have the power to do all of these things or not? That's sort of the question. But I felt like with yeah, I'm not gonna go there, but I still feel the whole like banking system plus
Mm.
wizards situation is still very much problematic in all the all the wrong ways.
Yeah, and I think that that's in this one we didn't really have it on the forefront, but you can see how it ended with the Weavers and the Breakers. They attack one of the banker carriages at a certain point in the story. So it's probably going to be much more prevalent in the last book.
Yeah,
Mm,
I very much expect it to be that, because it has to be like they're burning the bank again at the end of this book, and we'll
mhm.
see. We will see how that one goes. So what do you think of Rika and Rika's arc in this one?
Well, I've always been a fan of the North, and I liked her a lot. She was actually, for me, those were my favorite parts. She's also an extremely funny character, but I feel like the North has also evolved a little bit. Where in
Hmm?
the beginning, a lot of them were brutes, and you had the um, how is he called? At the end, he gets betrayed.
Oh, you mean Scar Nightfall?
Yes, I think that he was the type of character that we would have seen in the original trilogy, where the North means that you're ruthless and you're strong, and if you are the strongest one, if you win a fight, that's all that matters.
Yeah.
And then here we see, yeah, but you just got that name. You didn't really earn it. And now we have Rika, who is a woman, but she's extremely smart. And she uses the long eye. I don't know if she always sees what she says, but as long as people believe her, that's what matters.
Yeah. That's still the question. Who's the owl? Did I miss something, or did I forget my heraldry from one of the standalones? Right? We had that whole idea, like the wolf eating the sun, and the no, the
Something about
wolf
the
eating the sun, and the lion eating the wolf, and the sheep eating the lamb eating the lion. And that's as far as we got, right? Because the wolf is Scar Nightfall, the lion is Leo, the lamb is Orso, because he was called the young lamb at the end of book 1. So the question is, like, who's the owl that eats the lamb?
yeah. Well, would that be bias, or is that somebody that we haven't seen yet? Or
Yeah, that's a question I don't know, because maybe I just forgot my whole like heraldry stuff from earlier books. It might just be the guys over in Styria, like
Mhm.
Talons and whatnot. What's
Yeah,
his name?
I,
King of the king of Styria.
exactly, because I think that when he and Orso talked, they agreed that they were not going to make any promises.
Yeah,
So that could be it. Um,
who knows?
but I don't really know what to expect. But at the very least, I enjoyed Rika as a character, and I do hope that she at least prevails towards the end. Because she also wrote that letter to
Yeah, yeah.
Orso, like, a friend, you are going to be betrayed, like, be aware.
Hmm?
But Orso doesn't really know that it's her. Does he?
No, I don't think he does.
Hmm. But Ricky was my favorite character, and I don't know if you think that the North is portrayed better in this trilogy than in the original one, or
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's still very much full of cliches and stuff, but I guess I'm okay with it. I like the things that are happening. I did love the fact that we meet like Bethod's seeress and witch again.
Mhm.
Unless I'm like very much misreading it, but the witch with the golden thread in her face, I'm pretty sure that's the one they kill in the second or third book. I think the third one
Yeah,
in
yeah. I
Last Argument of King Arthur. Yeah,
I wasn't exactly sure, but I thought so. But I also didn't remember if we read about that in A Little Hatred or in this one, because for me it flows together as one
no,
big
no.
story.
We meet her this time around because she has to, help with the eye for Rika,
Yes.
and yeah, we first meet her there. What I'm interested in is to see how the whole Shanka thing goes, the flathead thing goes, because apparently they get humanized in a way which I appreciate.
Hmm.
I just don't know where this will be going in the future. But she talks to them, and we have that stuff.
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to have enough time in the final book, and that's funny in a way because I've always said like we have 9 books that will be enough, but we do have quite a bit of open plot lines that deserve the time, but I don't know if it's going to be enough just in a trilogy, and
Yeah,
maybe it's going to focus more on well Adwa and the North, but I hope that the
yeah,
Shenka are also going to be
yeah.
explored enough.
We will see. I mean,
Hmm.
as I said, like he makes a lot of things. He still opens up a lot of plot lines, and you have the whole thing with like Styria and Adjoa and Vitari, which is also nice to see her again, and
Yes.
and that stuff.
Yeah, I well with Vitari I'm thinking about what's her name? Vic.
Vic, yeah,
And I was wondering because I wasn't entirely sure myself when you have that reveal that she was the one who betrayed her brother. You also have almost a flashback of her youth where she doesn't really show any emotions, but then she learns how to use it to her advantage.
yeah.
So I was wondering, is he a psychopath? Is that like the reveal, or is that saying too much?
I would argue that it's once again one of those situations where the needs of survival can twist people into all kinds of very difficult people.
Hmm.
That's how I would read that in a lot of ways. I mean, especially the part where she betrays her brother.
Yes.
That's very much about like the needs of survival, how they change us and force us to do terrible things. But we
Hmm.
will see.
Yeah, it's just I got that from it, and especially when you are in her head a couple of times, it's her POV. You can see that she has a lot of guilt, but when you
Yeah,
then go back when she's younger, it almost shows her as showing no emotions, and then learning how to lie and learning how to mimic other people. And I thought,
yeah.
is this just something that's not that important? Because or does that mean that she is fooling everybody, including Glokta, that she cares?
I think that that's a good question. I mean, I would argue the point is that because of all these pressures, she had very little choice or like very little chance to actually develop her own personality, right? I mean, she takes on all these other personalities and stuff because she can. Yeah, we don't know if there is like a true Vic. We don't know if there's like a true Victorine Dan Teufel. What her personality is because she's always been warped by systems, right? I mean, that's part of the things. Like when we have that flashback about her learning how to, lie and stuff like that. It's very clear that it is that's part of like how the expectations for girls in the upper class of the union are, and then she goes over there, and I think that's a fairly clever thing to do because the union is very sexist.
Hmm.
And we know that, right, with Artie and Savine up to a point where we have those ideas that there's a lot of expectations placed on women, a lot of rules and so forth, and you can manipulate those. And and learning to live under that system of sexism in the Union does maybe prepare you to be more willing to bend to the system of oppression that goes on in the prison camps.
Mhm. Yeah, I can see what you mean, and that's especially that she was so young and that she already learned what the best way was to survive. Because you of course see the prison camps more as a situation where that leads oneself to just be extremely egocentrical because you need to do that to survive. But as a woman in the Union, it's not as bad, of course, but it's almost the same in a way.
It still
But
means
that,
you have to play with the expectations of others.
mhm. But then it will be interesting what happens in the third book, because where we left her, she's also in a quite interesting situation at the moment.
Yeah. Did you see that coming? That Pike was the Weaver.
Not at all. I had no idea, but also because Pike was a character that, well, up until the second half of this book, we haven't really seen that much of. And I don't even know if I remembered who he was and that he was in the camps originally. So,
Oh, he's like Pike shows up in the first trilogy, right?
mhm.
Pike is the other guy. I keep forgetting his name. He's the banker that gets tortured by Glocta in the first torture scene
Oh, okay.
in Blade itself. In the first or the second, there's like the guy Teufel and then the other guy from the bank. And those two, like the family of the Teufel family and the other whose name I keep forgetting right now, they are both sent to the camps. In the beginning, when Glocta is attacking the banking house of Valendenborg under Archlector, whatever his name is, the first one in the first trilogy, and then Pike shows up in book 2 when Colonel West goes into the north and goes into the prison camp to take people, and he takes Pike and whatever the name of the girl is that West does not actually get with, but the Dogman finally ends up with.
Yes. Hmm.
And those two are together, and then Pike comes to the Union, and it ends near the reveal that he is the guy that Glock has sent to the camps in the beginning is in the last or second to last scene in Last Argument of Kings, when West goes and is about to die, and Glocta is sitting there, and then Pike just threatens Glocta, and then Glocta gives him the job as Inquisitor because Pike is so removed from the guy that he was in the beginning.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that recap. Because now that you're saying it, I do remember. I just didn't know that was Pike. Even
I
with
just
that
wish I
knowledge,
remember his name.
I wouldn't have known it. But did you see that coming, or was it a surprise to you as well?
I think I saw it coming when he spared the life of the kid in the battle.
Mhm. Okay, yeah,
I
that's
mean, I was
early on.
wondering like who the Weaver could be, and I'm like, it's either either a traitor from like the Inquisition or it's one of the Magi.
Mhm.
That was sort of my thinking there.
Yeah, I could see that at the very least it would be somebody that we've already come across in one of the previous books. But that it was Pike was something that surprised me, but it is fitting. And it also shows that he is actually what Vic is at the same he had that same history, so he understands her in a way. And that's why I'm curious to see if Vic is going to be loyal towards him.
I think that chat message, "Can you please open the door?" was for you, Jolene.
Yes, that's my husband. I'm going to open the door really quickly.
Um, so, what can I say in the meantime? Yeah, I don't know. I keep forgetting what the name of Pike was, but I'm that kind of person. Um, I'm not good at doing like entertainment on my own while Jolene is doing. Ah, there you are.
Yes, I'm back. He said, "Thank you, Raf," because I was ignoring him.
Oh well, there you go. Um, what else was interesting in
Well,
this
I
book?
will say that Maggie says that Joe Abercrombie writes the best female fantasy characters. Savine and Ricky are awesome. Now, I do really enjoy Ricky. I think that Savine, for me, I liked her more in the first book, but I still think that I enjoy how she was written.
Yeah.
And I would say that in this second trilogy, at least the female characters are written better than the original trilogy.
In the first trilogy, the female characters are terrible, to put it mildly. I mean, Pharaoh is not a good character in any like way or form, and well, Adi is probably the best female character in the first trilogy, and Queen Therese, as we already said, was just like not handled well. I know what he was trying to do, but it ended up in a not so good way.
Yes, I can agree with that. And I think that then, well, but of course, already in the in the standalones, we already have some better female characters.
I can get with Monza, and I can get with whatever the female character in Red Country is called.
That was my favorite of the trilogies, but in terms of names, no idea. And I actually know that a lot of people think that she's extremely boring, but I
I don't
like
know.
her.
I mean, I think she. No, I mean, part of what Red Country does, I mean, it is very much an homage to Western, and you have that character of like the strong young female character in Western that is trying to do like save their family because apparently everyone else in the family is kind of kind of a waste of space, so to speak.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it's part of it's a bit of a cliche, but the whole idea is sort of to pay homage to that genre and do that. And I think she does work well in that regard. It's like, what do you expect? She's very focused.
Mhm. Yes, definitely. Um, what I was wondering is what you thought of Shivers.
I like Shivers. I think
Because
Shivers
I
is a really interesting, like his overall arc through all the books, from like when he shows up in Before They're Hanged.
Mhm.
I think he shows up in Before They're Hanged.
I think so too, but I'm definitely not the expert here.
Um, I always keep confusing whether the battle in the high places, which I really, really don't like, the Joe Abercrombie trying to write Helm's Deep, so to speak,
Mhm.
is in the second or the third book. I always keep confusing those two, but he shows up shortly before the battle in the high places for the first time, having this like grudge against Logan Nine Fingers, and then because he tries to not go there, and then he ends up in Best Served Cold and going through this arc of being this really terrible killer. And his arc of coming to terms with who he is, I feel is really interesting and is really cool.
Mhm. Yeah, because I think that Jose said earlier that he thought that Shivers and Logan Nine Fingers have a little bit of the same arc, but in a way, I think that it goes beyond that because we do see that Shivers in the beginning, well, he's called Shivers because he's basically a coward, even though he doesn't really dare to say it. So his whole arc, in a way, or his whole journey is he wants to change that, and then he wants
Mm,
to revenge his brother, I think, by killing Logan.
yeah, exactly.
But
Also, I don't think Shivers is in the Blade itself. I'm 100% sure he's not in the Blade itself, but I think he shows up in the second book.
okay, because Ozo said I think Shivers is in every book, but then starting from the second one, probably.
I think from the second one, yes, because he does not show up in the first book, because we don't get much Northman stuff in the first book. We only get Logan's like the opening thing. The is it already first chapter or the prologue when Logan fights hangs out with the dogman and whatnot and falls off the cliff. That's the only thing we get in the north, and then it's just Logan making his way to the south. We
Mhm.
don't get any of the dogman, three trees and so forth part. And Shivers shows up on the way to the high places. He confronts Logan and tells Logan that Logan killed his brother. And then Logan's like, "Yeah, I'm sorry about that. And you want to fight me?" And then he shrugs and just is angry about him the entire time.
Okay. And how long has it been since you've read the original trilogy, Raf? Because I don't remember it that clearly.
Last May, May
Okay.
2021.
Okay, that's around the same time as me. But I I like that he gets past that a little bit, because then
Hmm?
he's grown, and I would say that he's not as evil as Logan Nine Fingers is, and you can see that
But
especially towards Ricky. He
do you think Logan Ninefingers is evil?
I think that the Bloody Nine is evil. I don't think that Logan
Yeah,
is
I
per
mean
se.
that goes without saying.
Yeah, and I think that you can definitely say that Logan is almost an innocent bystander when the Bloody Nine comes forward. I don't know if we can really see it as almost a psychosis or something that he's not really responsible for.
I think there's a lot of things that go on with that Logan Ninefinger thing that I and a Bloody Nine thing that I personally really appreciated when I read it, because what with fantasy being so influenced by Dungeons and Dragons role playing games and so forth, and all those barbarian characters in Dungeons and Dragons and other role playing games always have that thing called berserker rage, where you can do all these crazy things and stuff with your characters. Like the first time I read Logan Ninefingers turning into the Bloody Nine, that was like the first time someone was like, yeah, that's how you would actually represent that. It changes. He's a different person in that regard. And he has no control over that, and you can see him struggle with that throughout the books. Right? He's Logan doesn't want the Bloody Nine to show up
Hmm.
most of the time, but sometimes he's more like resigned to the fact that if you push him hard enough, the Bloody Nine will come out. But it's not like he's like welcoming the Bloody Nine or really aiming for the Bloody Nine to show up or anything like that. I think that's why I would not call Logan evil. There's several situations where he's actively trying to not turn into the Bloody Nine.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that in well, you definitely have some characters who I would call evil in the entire series. I don't think that Logan fits,
Hmm?
but it's a difficult one because he is the Nine, and how can you? I don't think that you can separate them entirely, even though he can't help it.
I mean that's part of the question, right? It's like is how much of that is actually his choice? Because usually it's other people that put him into situations where he turns into the Bloody Nine,
Hmm.
which is a bit like the whole gun abroad thing kind of thing. But
Yes, and
now,
it's
yeah,
it's difficult to have the right level of nuance here, but and that's maybe also what Joe Abercrombie is trying to say with this trilogy or with this series. Most people are evil between brackets because they are pushed. Nobody is going to do that unprovoked. And I think
yeah.
that the villain that you have in other fantasy series where somebody is evil just because, you don't really have that in this series. But I think that still you have other options.
Well, that's the question right there. Is like I'm not going to go there, but I would argue that outside of very few fantasy books, you don't have a villain that is evil just because. That's very few fantasy books outside of, say, Christian allegory, where you definitely have that because, of course, you need it in that build up. But yeah, that's the question. Like, is in the first trilogy, is Khalul the prophet? Is Khalul evil? I mean, he clearly wants world domination and is in favor of cannibalism. So, how much slack can you cut that guy?
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely understand what you're saying. I think that the big difference here is also that you have those POVs.
Hmm?
So you understand the characters better because you do have that internal monologue. Where maybe in other fantasy series where you have the villain who's not just evil just because, you don't really
Yeah,
have that.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question. It's like when you read those, especially the standalones, who's the bad guys? Like with the first trilogy, it's fairly easy to see who's supposed to be the bad guy because it's the Gurkish Empire with the Prophet trying to take over places. It's fairly comparatively clear cut. best served cold, who's the bad guy?
Yeah, it's not an easy question, and I think that that's also what this. Well, I would say probably bias, and that's also what also you're saying. I think that bias is a shade worse than Kalul.
I am not sure about the Bayaz Kalul thing. I have issues with both and the depiction of both, and that's part of the problems I get. It still really hangs so much on how that whole thing is going to be resolved at the end of Wisdom of Crowds, because the idea of having these magic people manipulating entire countries to do stuff is problematic.
Mm-hmm.
I see what Abercrombie was trying to do with the Gurkish in a lot of ways. When you read the first trilogy, right, you have these the Union is very much England, almost Victorian England in a lot of ways, with those wasteful officers and shit like that. It works really well. But the Gurkish, while you could probably read them as an Orientalist parody, so to speak, from the Union's point of view, he kind of fails in that regard, and it ends up being very much an Orientalist cliche with everyone being brown-skinned, pseudo-Arabic, religious fanatics and stuff like that. I'm like, I don't know, man. I know what you're trying to do, but it fails. Mm-hmm. Having that whole thing change this time around and having them as refugees in the Union works much better for me. I'm not quite sure why, because we don't get like Kalul's perspective, and there is that whole like rivalry between Kalul and Bayaz, and yeah, who knows who's worse? But I mean, they're wizards, right? They're supposed to be, I don't know, I don't want to say beyond good and evil, but they're certainly playing along different with different rules, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that one of the things that, even though I'm enjoying the series as a whole, I would have liked to see more of Bias. I know that the entire idea is that he is mysterious and that you don't really know what's going on, and that because that's also how the people in Ardua are feeling. Bias is making decisions. They don't really know why. They just know that they need to listen because otherwise bad things are going to happen. Mm. But I would have liked to see more. Like, where is he now? And what is he doing? Yeah, that might not be the scope of the series, but...
I mean, if you read the first trilogy, as I would, as something of a deconstruction of, especially Lord of the Rings, which I think it is, in a lot of ways, Bayaz is very much a deconstruction of Gandalf. He's the wizard who claims to know better, and people have to follow him, which is very much the role that, say, Gandalf has in Lord of the Rings. The difference is that, of course, with Lord of the Rings, following Gandalf makes sense within the cosmology because Gandalf is clearly the morally right guy to follow in a lot of ways. It makes sense because Lord of the Rings does have this sort of more Christian mythology going on, this Christian morality going on. Bayaz is just showing up. It's like, hey, I'm an old wizard, so you'd better follow me and do what I tell you. And if you don't, I'll pressure you to do what I want. So he does that, and that's sort of in a way where I feel Bayaz's really terrible monologues come from, because Gandalf does have a lot of terribly long monologues in Lord of the Rings. Gandalf is very much mansplaining the entire thing. And Bayaz does the same thing, and everyone is just like, oh, gods, man, just shut up. So I feel there's a lot of that going on just from the setup, what Abercrombie is trying to do. And you can pinpoint specific events in the first trilogy that are specific deconstructions of events in Lord of the Rings, like that near the end of Blade itself, when you have that council, when they decide to actually go on that quest. That's clearly a deconstruction of the Council of Elrond. And the battle in the high places is very much Joe Abercrombie's take on the Battle of Helm's Deep and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think that that's maybe why I enjoyed the original trilogy more, just because it's... you have a lot more recognizable points of fantasy. You
Hmm?
have that quest, you have the wizard that in the beginning you might think that he is to be trusted, and then slowly as the trilogy progresses you realize, ah no, this is a different take on that.
Hmm?
While this trilogy is definitely much more evolved, I don't really have a fantasy feeling here, which
No,
is not
this
necessarily a
is
bad
clearly,
thing, but
yeah. This is clearly Joe Abercrombie dealing, and I think it reads way more British than the first trilogy. This is very much dealing with the beginnings of industrialization, all the things that come with that, which have had a huge impact on British history and British culture. Which, when you look at like the quotes, and like I was really happy in the first book that he actually quotes Terry Pratchett in one of the epigraphs or one of the books within Little Hatred. But that there's a lot of you know coming to terms with being British and being English in these books. And the whole movement of industrialization, breaking down the mills, the Luddite movement, the beginnings of communism, because though both Engels and Marx were German, they did all their work in England because that's where like these beginnings of industrialization hit really hard, and you can see all these elements show up there. It's way more looking at your own very specific British or English, whatever you want to call it, history, and how that sort of impacts how you look at the world nowadays, which kind of makes sense once again because you have like Tolkien writing his stories. Like, I'm writing this in the hopes that it could also be seen as a mythology for England, because England doesn't have like its own like whatnot mythology, and Abercrombie deconstructing that, going like, this is if we write fantasy based on our own history, this is how it would look like. I think that's what he's trying to do there.
mhm. Would you then say that this is a world without hope? Because I know that if I start talking about grimdark, you'll probably have to laugh. But a lot of people say that this is a world without hope, and we also mentioned that these people are not necessarily evil, but they have to do evil acts in order to survive.
That's a good question. I would argue that the first trilogy definitely is a world without hope,
Mhm,
and I am not sure. It really depends how that third book ends for me,
mhm. Yes.
because for a lot of time, like Abercrombie does write these books where it's like people are trying to do their best, but at the end they'll just be ground down by the system. There's no escape from that. There's a lot of nihilism in what Abercrombie wrote in the first trilogy, and at least in parts of the standalones. So it really depends how that thing ends. If there's like actual progress on a say on a level for the actual people.
Mhm. And could you, well, if you have the original trilogy without
Hmm.
hope, then, in your opinion,
Yeah.
but if it progresses towards a world where there is hope, doesn't that mean
Hmm.
that the original one also has hope?
I would say no, because if the progress only happens in the second trilogy, like when you read the first trilogy, there's no change in the actual status quo of the world between book one and book three of the first trilogy.
Mhm.
The world's still shit at the end of that.
Yeah, true.
And characters do kind of end up where they started. I think that's like the largest problem with Abercrombie in that regard, is that when you look at Logan, he kind of starts he explicitly ends where he starts, right? By jumping into a river.
Yes.
And I think that's sort of like the main issue there, is that people, despite all their struggles, end up where they're starting.
And if the second trilogy ends that way, could it be
Yeah.
done well?
Hmm?
Or would that be a negative for you?
That's a difficult question. See, I would say you can do this very well. I would personally disagree with the worldview, but that doesn't mean it's not done well. And I would say the first, like so far, the second trilogy is done extremely well.
Mhm.
And I can personally disagree with that worldview in a lot of ways, and would say, I would prefer a book that does leave, possibilities for hope, because I think that's helpful with fantasy. Hope doesn't mean it has to be like a happy ending. That's not the point.
Yeah.
It should it should leave the possibility that things could change. And if you're shutting off the possibilities for change, that's something that I have an issue with. But it doesn't mean it doesn't work well. I think that's sort of the problem that we all face, right? It's like you look at the universe out there, our world out there, and you're like, cynicism seems to be the easy way to go. It's very easy to be a cynic these days. And it can be not rewarding, but it can be satisfying to just indulge that cynicism and just make edgy jokes and cynical jokes about the world. That can be very rewarding in the situation as a quick escape. Because having hope is kind of tough. It's kind of hard. Hoping that against all the odds, you can still change the world for better. That's tough. That's really hard, and it usually doesn't end well. So the cynicism often feels like the easy way out in a way. It's sort of like a quick fix.
Puts some responsibility with you as well, as if you can say, well, I can't really change anything, then you don't really have a lot of responsibility, and then it could be an easy way of letting go of everything. And I can definitely see what you mean with having the ending does not need to be happy, because I don't know if that would be fitting for the theme of the books that we've seen so far. But it needs to seem that there's a possibility, and that's why I had an issue with the original trilogy as well. The ending, I didn't like it. That doesn't mean it needed to be a happy ending, but the pointlessness of everything that happened in between was something that I disliked.
Yeah, it feels like personal choices don't matter, because at the end the system will just... And yeah, I can see that, right? It often feels like that for us, right? In our daily life. So it's relatable in a lot of ways. But I feel fiction should do more.
And do you then think that Orso not killing Leo, is that a good sign or not?
I think it's a pretty positive sign.
Because I didn't really know how to think about it. Because on the one hand, he has hated Leo the entire time. He has been the face of the rebellion. He has married the woman that he was in love with.
Yeah.
But in the end, he doesn't kill him.
Yeah.
Because he wants to still somehow, because he pities Savine in a way, I think. But is that fair? In the end, Leo is one of the people who was mainly responsible for the rebellion. Yes, he was used as a puppet, but everybody else was killed. Why give him a chance to redeem himself?
I think it works because Leo realizes it, right? We have that whole scene with the hangings and whatnot, and Leo just not like anyone else. Everyone else is justifying and railing and whatnot, and Leo is just like, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I fucked up. I'm really sorry. And I think that's the key, because it only works because Leo is growing from that situation. So they can both grow in their way. And I think that's the important key there. It's like Leo is, for the first time in a long while, actually learning something.
Came late, but just on time.
Yeah, but that's the important thing. Is like there is personal growth happening there that might just be rewarded. And that's sort of what was missing in the first book, right? Because in the first trilogy, because there's very little personal growth happening there.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think that that's a good sign for Leo. I think that will also be very interesting to see what he and Savine will do in the third book.
Yeah.
Because I could also imagine that there's quite a bit of resentment from Leo towards Savine, because she has played him quite a bit. And I don't know if he's going to realize that.
It'll be very interesting to see how Leo, as a character, develops. I mean, there's a parallel which I find it really interesting going on with Savine and for better or worse, men in her life, right? Because her father, for better or worse, is Glocta, who is has a lot of disabilities, and her husband Leo is very much like a mirror image of Glocta, of Santa Glocta in a way, right? He's like physically strong, beautiful, attractive, a great fighter, and all of these things. And now he's got a disability. He's lost his leg and stuff like that. So how's he going to deal with the fact that the one thing that made him stand out, which was his physical prowess, has been taken away?
It does also lean towards that vicious cycle, because then you have
Yeah,
Savine, who, like her mother, is now a substance abuser.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
not alcohol, but it's also a type of drug. So
Well, it's basically cocaine.
yes, well, indeed. But I think that for Leo there is a chance of redemption, you could almost say, in the third book. But Orso didn't know that. He just sees multiple people who are going to be hanged, and he chooses to save one.
Yeah.
And he doesn't know the internal monologue there. So I don't know
No.
if that for Orso.
No, but the I'm sorry was like external. He says that loud.
Yes.
That's his like last words, so to speak. Also, hi Liam. Glad you could join.
He hasn't read Abercrombie yet, so I don't know if it's the right move, but
I think it is. I just find it interesting to see how, because the interesting thing with Savine and the people around her is exactly that it's very much depending on like appearance in a lot of ways. And Sandang Glocta has terrible appearance in a lot of ways, right? His public image is not exactly top notch. But Leo was exactly that. He was all public image, and that's why she agreed to the marriage for lots of reasons, right? And now that part has been stripped. So the question is like, does Leo Dunbrock develop any other quality? I mean, we all know he's a nice guy in his heart. He's just really dumb and full of prejudice. But it's also very clear that he's naive and tries to be a nice dude.
I wonder, because Savine has also had a rough awakening.
Well, she's had the second rough awakening at this point.
Yes.
I mean, that's the question, like, is she capable of learning or moving beyond that? Because she had her first like rough awakening during the whole Valbec thing, and now she has had the second one. So the question is like where she's going with that now.
Yeah, that's true. It could be that she is the type of person who just cannot grow out of that.
Yeah.
Will be interesting to see in the third one. And then we have said this a couple of times, it will really depend on how that one ends to have like a general perception of the trilogy.
Yeah.
But will that change how you think of the second book, for instance, significantly? Or do you view them as separate books?
Now that's a good question. I would say it will definitely change how I view books, because it's clearly, I mean, this trilogy does set up sort of things, and if you set up things, it really depends on the resolution at the end of the day, because that can recontextualize everything.
Yeah, that is true. And I think that even now with the second trilogy, I already look at the first one differently.
Yeah.
So it's almost impossible to look at them as separate books.
I mean, as separate books, this second trilogy so far has been extremely well constructed, and I think that's partly what I really appreciate about what Abercrombie does and how he's learned. When I say like that, he took a lot of techniques that he developed or like perfected during the standalones, and he's just adding all of these things together. One thing that I really like is his battle scenes, and you can see him, the thing that he developed so much in the Heroes, the way he does his, like, when he does do like his his battle scenes, when you follow one character and then they run across another character and they have like an interaction, and then he switches the point of view character to the other person in that interaction, and then he moves with
Mhm.
that character to the next, which is a super cinematic technique, right? It's basically how you would film that whole thing. You follow that one character, they have that interaction, and then you follow the next one with your camera, basically. And he started doing that. Well, I mean, I think he started doing it in the first book, and he really perfected it during the Heroes, which is,
Mhm.
I mean, technically it's just like one huge battle for like 3 days and like one
Yes.
entire book. And you have these scenes coming up here again, and it works really well at this point. The way he does these kind of things, and his language is. And you said that earlier, that there are all these things that become boring after a while. I think it kind of depends on how you look at these things, because Abercrombie has always been big on the catchphrases and like repetitions of certain elements and stuff, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
And he
it's a
does.
style that he has. Yeah.
Yeah, it's always been a style that he has. Like, for example, during the first part of this, like during A Little Hatred, how every time Rika comes out of her like trance, the first like part of that scene is always the same, right? It's
Mhm.
always, the head hurt. She spits out the dowel between her teeth and she says "fuck," and then it's always the other one whose name I keep forgetting, is Sana Fail. She's like, "That's my girl." And that's
Yes.
every time. That's the same ritual. And he does play with that this time around. We have that one chapter where you have these like nested visions of her. That was really clever. Where,
Mhm.
where she dreams, where she has a vision, and then she wakes up from that vision,
Yeah.
and then she has that reaction, and then she wakes up from the next vision, and you only realize that because it's her father, right? The dogman is standing next to her, and it starts with that. That's the fourth vision this week, and you have all these like nested visions, and it ends once again with her waking up, and he's like, "That's the fourth vision this week," and you're like, "Oh, that was all just one
Mhm.
nested like vision, dream, whatever." And I think he's doing a lot of these like structural things that I really appreciate.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that scene as well, where
Mhm.
it almost felt how much
It's
it was
very much
difficult
it's
to
very much
experience.
Inception. It's very much Inception, but
Mhm.
in the north.
Exactly. With the dogman, for example, he died in
Yeah.
this book, and I didn't really have a strong reaction as I would have expected.
I, what I found really clever is that we don't actually see his death scene, right? We
Mhm.
see his death scene sort of in Rika's vision, and then she comes back and he's dead. And I'm like, okay,
And do we actually know if what she says she sees is true?
no,
Because in the beginning, of course, that's the case, but then after all the events happen and she chooses to close one eye,
no, no, no,
I
we
don't
don't
know
know.
if okay.
We don't know how much of that is actually stuff that she sees and how much she's actually just, manipulating people to do what she wants. We don't know.
Mhm. Yeah, I by the way, I must say that yes, the using the same formula, it's a criticism that I have, but at the same time, I do quite enjoy it.
Hmm?
It's a 9 book long series, and so far, with the exception of Best Served Cold, I have enjoyed all of them. And I'm usually not somebody who can read a 9 book long series and not fall off halfway through. So
Yeah, yeah. I think it kind of works in a way because, as I said, like it's a very TV style kind of thing how he does that. And when you watch like a TV show, you have these like very specific recognizable parts of your visual language that come up again and again as something to keep you engaged and just say like, yeah, that part.
mhm,
And and Abercrombie translates that into his writing. And like the first trilogy, it certainly say the whole you got to be realistic about these things and stuff like that. And he just takes that as part of his language, and I think it's Abercrombie's recognizable. It's like you read like two sentences of any Abercrombie book, and you know it's Abercrombie, and
mhm.
that's something not many authors manage to actually achieve.
That's true. And do you think that his writing style is then his strongest point?
What? Sorry, I
If
didn't
if
catch that.
his writing style is his strong suit almost, that's the thing that's best in his series.
I think like his strength is partly his very dry, very specific humor. The way he writes dialogue, that's his strength.
Hmm.
I would say like Abercrombie's way of very specific dialogue is his strength, and the way he visually sets up action scenes, that's his strength. Plot, not so much. World building, not so much. But like the way, like his absolute strength is writing these very specific, dry dialogues and scenes like that. And I was interesting is like back in the day when I regularly read his blog, right? The way he writes books is very interesting because most of the time you can see him writing. It was, I think, for Red Country of the Heroes. Like he at the time he was writing stuff, and his like rewriting and editing process was mostly cutting out stuff. Like he writes a scene and then he just cuts out all the words that don't necessarily have to be there, which leads to this like super sparse style that he has. It's like, he basically removes all the words that aren't like absolutely necessary to still make sense of what he's writing. And I think that's a very, very interesting approach to like writing and building his story in a way.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't know that that was how he did it. And it's interesting because I think that usually I like authors who use more words than necessary. While with Abercrombie, I enjoy his writing style. I think that halfway through this book, I
Mhm.
realized I don't even know what's going on. I don't know if this book is going to have a plot, right up until the point that Savine said, okay, I'm in for this rebellion and this is how we're
Yeah.
going to do it. Up until that point, I didn't really know where it was going, but I was enjoying the way that it was told.
I think the interesting part is like how you can use language or like the way you do that style um to create atmosphere or create a feeling that just like actually goes beyond things like that very sparse, very dry thing, very dry style that he has. It does create a very specific expectation from the reader, like how things will be, how still it's a very laconic style in a way. It's like it sometimes reminds me of Cormac McCarthy, just with
Hmm,
way more like Britishness in it. McCarthy
okay.
has a similar approach. Like when you read stuff like The Road, it does have that very. He also has this like very very sparse prose where like all excess words are just like purged from like dialogue and stuff. It's just like
Hmm. That's good to hear because I have mentioned that I am going to give the road a try since I have it on my shelves apparently. So it will be nice to maybe draw a comparison between the two in terms of writing
as I said,
style
like
then.
McCarthy has like way less humor.
Okay, yeah. I have heard that The Road is quite a bleak book. If it's I've seen the movie and that was quite bleak as well. So
The book is fairly bleak. I would argue that Blood Meridian is even darker.
hmm, okay.
Blood Meridian is probably the bleakest book I've ever read. It's incredibly bleak, and it's absolutely fantastic. Just
Okay, so highly recommend.
it's very dark, and you can see that kind of thing, influence in books by authors like R. Scott Baker and possibly Joe Abercrombie in a way,
Mhm.
just for like
Now,
what is possible.
yeah, I am curious to see how I will like it. But
Yeah.
I think that for this book, we've said the majority that we
Yes.
found important. The
Mhm.
final thing that I want to ask is, do you think that we're going to see Logan in the final book, or have we seen the end of him in Red Country?
That's very much a good question. I have no idea. Right now, I would say it's a 50-50 chance.
Mhm. I hope
It's a
so.
50-50 chance for him
But
to show up. Although I hope if he shows up, it will be just him, just walking through and just you as the reader recognize it, but people don't recognize him.
mhm.
That's what I would hope. I don't want another like bloody nine scene. I just want him to just walk past or something.
Yeah, something completely unexpected. It's like in the Heroes, I think we also
Mhm.
have that battle scene where people are using the Bloody Nine, and there's
Yeah,
a lot of confusion, and they keep saying, "Oh, the Bloody Nine is here to use that fear," but in the end, he wasn't there at all.
yeah,
And I
exactly.
like that inclusion of him in
Mhm.
a way that you wouldn't expect.
Very much.
Mhm. So I think that we will end it
Okay,
here, and we will definitely just meet up for the final book, The Wisdom of Crowds,
definitely.
somewhere in January, probably.
Hmm.
But thanks everybody for joining. Thanks, Raf, of course, for giving a little bit of extra insight as always.
Thank
And
you.
see you guys next time.